Hello again, class. Today we're going to talk about the age of Jackson. We'll probably have, my guess is at least 3 lectures on Andrew Jackson, maybe 4. This era is also known as the era of the common man. So we'll talk about the changes in politics that really took place partly because of Andrew Jackson, partly just in coincidence with his rise to power. But we'll focus for the next few lectures on Andrew Jackson and what's called either the age of Jackson or the era of the common man. So Andrew Jackson's perhaps the first American politician that really campaigned to and appealed to commoners. Before that, remember, we had all these series of presidents from the Virginia planting class. They'd all been very rich. They were elected by members of the Electoral College who were probably just like them. And you didn't really have a lot of people voting in those elections, primarily because you had to be not only white and male, but you also had to own property during the first several presidential elections. So in the first part of the country, the first part of, the first 20, 30, 40 years, you didn't have a huge number of common people voting. And that's going to start to change in the 1820s. And Andrew Jackson's right in the middle of it. All right, so remember we finished talking in our last series of lectures, the early Republic lectures. We ended with the era of good feelings, where we only had one political party, the country was at peace, and everybody seemed happy and content under James Monroe's presidency. Well, that's going to end pretty quickly. James Monroe, like all presidents since Washington, retired after 2 terms. And so in 1824, you had 4 people all running as Democratic Republicans who ran to replace Monroe. And the Democratic Party is going to start breaking down based on the different groups within the party that support these candidates. All right, so who are the candidates? Yeah, John Quincy Adams, William Crawford, Henry Clay. We're going to talk a lot about Henry Clay over the next several weeks. He's going to pop in and out of these lessons quite a bit. He's going to run for president at least 3 times, and a spoiler alert right here. He's never actually going to win, but he's going to keep running, and he's just going to kind of be in the middle of everything for the next almost 30 years of American politics. And finally, Andrew Jackson. Now, I know what you're all thinking. You're thinking, okay, well, he must win because this is called the age of Jackson, but not quite yet. Now, he won the popular vote. All right, he got the most votes. So if you look at this graphic on the right of your screen, the green states and the green part of those pie charts stands for Jackson. And you can see with popular vote, he got 43% of the popular vote. The next biggest total was John Quincy Adams at 31%. Now, as we should know by now, the popular vote isn't really what elects the president. It's the Electoral College. And even in the Electoral College, Jackson got the most votes, but he didn't get half. He didn't get 50%. He only got 38% versus John Quincy Adams' 32%. And then Crawford and Clay kind of split the other 32% among them. All right, so Andrew Jackson gets the most votes both in the popular vote among the people voting and in the Electoral College. But since he didn't get to 50%, the Constitution says the House of Representatives decides the winner. This should immediately make you think of another election we talked about, the election of 1800, where you had Jefferson and Burr in a tie. That election also went to the House of Representatives. So here it is, 2 times, in the first, 50 years of the country, less than 50 years, the election is going to be decided not by the Electoral College, but by the House of Representatives. there will be one other instance where the Congress gets involved in picking a winner after Reconstruction. But otherwise, this is not something that's happened in a long time in our country. But it happened twice there right at the beginning, in 1800 and 1824. So, to make a long story short, Henry Clay ends up supporting John Quincy Adams. And with Clay's support, he was a very important, influential member in the House of Representatives. He supports John Quincy Adams. And so John Quincy Adams ends up getting 50% or more of the vote in the House of Representatives, so John Quincy Adams becomes president. And wouldn't you know it, almost immediately John Quincy Adams names Henry Clay to be his Secretary of State. So this should make you think of Alexander Hamilton's Assumption Plan, when Jefferson and Madison were initially opposed to it, until they had a dinner meeting one night, and then lo and behold, right after that dinner, Jefferson and Madison now supported Hamilton's Assumption Plan, and Hamilton just so happened to support putting the national capital in Washington, D.C., outside of Virginia. So something similar seems to have happened in 1824, although again, I don't believe there's any real public record of it. We just know sort of the end results, which is John Quincy Adams received support from Henry Clay, and wouldn't you know it, happens to reward Henry Clay to be his Secretary of State. All right, now, if you think this sounds a little sleazy, so did Jackson and his supporters. They called this the corrupt bargain. Now, I'll give you another spoiler. Jackson will eventually become president, and he's also going to reward people who supported him with plum government jobs, so he probably didn't have a right to be too upset about this, but he was. He was anyway. And he and his supporters called this the corrupt bargain. And they were outraged. And people who supported him and people who thought this was, in fact, kind of a sleazy thing to do, really came out. And the next time you're going to have election in 1824, the vote turnout is nearly going to double when Jackson ran Adams again. A couple reasons for this. One is, a lot of states were starting to get rid of the requirement that you own land to vote. And so all of a sudden more people were eligible to vote. So that's one reason more people voted. You just had more people eligible to vote because you no longer had to own land. But the second thing was, a lot of people were so angry about what happened in 1824, they wanted to make sure they voted. And Jackson really appealed to this group of people who weren't necessarily rich or landowners. So what is the legacy of 1824? It's this. More people, especially people living in the West and in rural areas, began voting. Now, as an aside, and just as a reminder, when we're talking about the 1820s and we talk about the quote West, we're not talking about California, Nevada, and Arizona like we would be today. That area hadn't been acquired by the United States yet, and those weren't states. So when we talk about the West in the 1824, we're talking about Tennessee, Kentucky, Mississippi, Alabama, places like that, the Northwest Territory, etc. Okay, so if you remember anything about the election of 1824, remember that it's going to lead to more voting. Okay, this is going to be a theme. This is why a lot of times the age of Jackson is also known as the era of the common man, because the common man is going to start voting. All right? No longer it's going to be just the wealthy elite up in Massachusetts or New York or the Virginia plantation class. It's just going to be commoners, people who work in factories, people who have small farms, who just barely make enough to survive. And those are the people who are going to begin voting. Okay. And so let's, again, when you think of Jackson, when you think of this election of 1824, think about what it did to cause more and more people to get involved in American politics. All right, so before we get to Jackson's presidency, let's talk quickly about John Quincy Adams, and I do mean quickly. All right, so who was he? Well, he was the son of John Adams, first of all. So it's going to be the first of only 2 times so far that the son of a president grows up to be president. All right, so John Quincy Adams was John Adams' son, and he is going to, in fact, become president, albeit just for 4 years, just like his father. And he came into office with big plans. He was going to build roads and canals, what they called internal improvements back then. He was going to promote education and science. He was going to regulate resources. But the problem is Jackson had a lot of supporters in Congress, and they simply refused to go along with anything Adams wanted. And so they defeated any of his proposals. All right, so you may see some parallels to modern day life back during this time period. Jackson's supporters were very much geared towards making sure John Quincy Adams was a one-term president and that he didn't win re-election. So they weren't going to do anything that would have supported his plans in case they actually were successful and he got credit. Okay, so Jackson pretty much spent those 4 years preparing to be president. All right. So again, you don't necessarily need to write this one bullet point down. Just as a reminder, though, during the era of good feelings, the first party system, or that party system, where you had multiple political parties, the first one, which was Federalists versus Democrat Republicans, disappeared because the Federalists lost all power. Okay. So we talked about that in our era of good feelings, that there was only one party. All right. And this system that we have, where we have multiple political parties fighting each other, that's called a party system. All right. And so the first one was those Federalists versus Democratic Republicans we talked about so much during the early Republic lectures. But now start taking notes on this. But the feud between John Quincy Adams and Andrew Jackson is going to lead to the second party system. All right, the second time you had political parties rise up against each other. And this time, instead of being Hamilton versus Jefferson, it's going to be centered much more on Andrew Jackson versus John Quincy Adams. Because there was such bad feeling between them and their supporters based on what happened in the election of 1824 that the Democratic Party, the Democratic Republican Party is going to be split into 2. Okay, so Jackson supporters became known as Democrats. Okay? And this should be easy for you to remember, because what is Jackson known for, and what is this time period known for? Basically expanded democracy. Now democracy is there for not just people who own land, but for just common people as well. Now again, you still have to be a white male, but that land owning requirement is gone. So democracy has been expanded to quite a bit more people. And so Jackson supporters became known as Democrats. Adams supporters, on the other hand, became known as Whigs. All right, now that's not like with the thing you wear in your head. Pronounced the same way, spelled differently, but that's an old political party name from England, and so that was the name that Adams and his supporters ended up using, the Whigs. And as you might guess, since you've probably never heard of the Whigs Party before, it's not going to last all that long. It's going to fall apart in the years prior to the Civil War. But it is one of the 2 major political parties in the U.S. for a couple decades. Now, what did they argue about? What did these 2 parties disagree about? Well, on one hand, a lot of the same things that the Federalists and the Democratic Republicans had argued about. For instance, they argued about tariffs. Democrats, like the old Democratic Republicans, were opposed to tariffs, and Whigs, like the old Federalists, favored tariffs. Okay. Now, and if you see, let's go back. If you see this drawing, or not drawing, but this chart I have on the right, it kind of sets out what they believed in. The Democrats were very similar to the Democratic Republicans, wanted a weaker government, opposed tariffs, did not like a national bank, whereas the Whigs generally wanted a stronger federal government. They favored government spending. They supported tariffs. And as we're going to see, a lot of them are going to favor a national bank, which Andrew Jackson certainly does not. Okay, so, the Democrats were pretty similar to the Democratic Republicans, whereas the Whigs were pretty similar to the old Federalist Party. Maybe not always exactly, because Andrew Jackson didn't mind some manufacturing. They weren't quite as agricultural based as the old Democratic Republicans were, but it's still pretty similar. All right, so the 1828 election comes around, and I already told you twice as many people voted. And as you can see on this map, blue is for Andrew Jackson, and this time he really wins very handily against John Quincy Adams. As you can see, John Quincy Adams really didn't get any votes outside of New England, with the exception of New Jersey, which is still pretty far north, and he got some of the New York votes. But otherwise, all of the West and all of the South went for Andrew Jackson. So once again, we've looked at some of these electoral college maps in the past, and review and make sure you pay attention to the geographic. Look how the country is and continues to be, and will continue to be, divided among geographic regions. And this time, Andrew Jackson's taking not just the South, but also the West and even the Northwest, that old Northwest territory that we've talked about so much. Now, one of the things that makes this election somewhat memorable is, Jackson became one of the first, perhaps the very first presidential candidate to really appeal to the interest of common people. And he promised to protect those interests. And he accused Adams of caring more about the elite and wealthy people. And why this becomes important is because, there's a lot more common people or poor people than there are the rich and the elite wealthy people. Okay? So, this is going to become a theme in presidential politics all the way up until today. Anybody running for president has to appeal not just to the rich people. Certainly getting the rich people on your side and getting them to donate money to your cause helps. But you have to convince non-rich people to vote for you, because ultimately there's more of them who are going to be voting. And so Jackson, presumably kind of understood this, because he appealed to those common people. And even if it wasn't just for political purposes, Jackson was our first president, as we're going to see, who didn't really grow up rich. Right? He grew up kind of poor. He grew up just on a small farm out in the West, and so he identified with the common man, and he promised to protect their interest, and so they really supported him. And he also promoted this idea of majority rule. Now, again, a lot of that goes back to he won more votes the first time, but didn't actually win the election. And so this is going to be a big theme, that if you get 50% of the vote, or if you get more votes, you should win the election. And so he's going to promote that. And as we see, he's going to convince a lot more people to come out and vote to put this into action. Okay. But it's during Jackson that these ideas that are so common to us now, that the majority rules, that everybody should vote, these ideas started really sprouting and becoming more and more ingrained in American thought during this age of Jackson. And so this idea of spreading political power to all, or at least many more, because again, it was still limited to white men, but this idea of spreading political power to all, not just the rich, wealthy people who went to Ivy League schools, but to all people, regardless of their economics or what they do for a living. This idea became known as Jacksonian democracy. And as I've already said, this time period became known as the era of the common man. right, so, and this will be the last slide we talk about in this lesson, but let's kind of compare Jeffersonian democracy versus Jacksonian democracy. Because remember, Jefferson was also about limiting the power of the federal government, appealing to people who owned farms and things like that. So there are a lot of similarities between Jefferson and Jackson, but there are some differences. All right. Jefferson, just kind of to put bluntly, Jefferson was kind of a snob. All right. He owned, I think it's somewhere upward of 6,000 books or something like that, at a time when most people were lucky to own 2 or 3 books. Okay, he could speak or read multiple languages, very well educated, very rich, and Jefferson was somewhat of a snob. So he thought of democracy. Yes, he didn't believe in kings and queens. He thought the government should be run by people, but he really kind of focused on your well-educated and very capable people. Where Jackson was much more broad. He thought government should be for all the people, and all the people should participate, not just sort of your elite people who got to go to the fanciest schools or had the most money. All right. Now Jefferson believed in democracy in political life, whereas white landowners could vote. But again, he was kind of a snob. All right. He wasn't going to be associating with common people. He was going to live on his plantation, kind of seclusion from normal people. Whereas Jackson, yes, he believed in more democracy, whereas white males could vote, but not only in political life, but in social and economic life. Right? He believed people, regardless of kind of their economic or social status, should have some amount of and be treated equally and the same. All right, so Jefferson, as we know, supported farmers and wanted this country to be mainly just a group of people involved in agriculture and farming. And Jackson supported farmers too. After all, as I said, he kind of came from the West and was born on the farm. But Jackson also supported laborers and workers in manufacturing plants, in industrial society. All right, so he wasn't focused on just agriculture, but also in industry. All right, so he saw the fact that not only did regular small farmers need support from the government, and the government should be there to protect them, but also, just your average worker who's working in a factory need protection from the government as too. Okay. Lastly, Jefferson, as we know, believed in limited government, but at least when someone other than him was president, he really was much more about the states' rights. The federal government shouldn't be too active. It should be all about legislatures and states. Whereas Jackson, he did support limited government too, except he thought there should be a strong president. All right, Jackson is really going to be one of these, perhaps the first president we have who really starts to assert the dominancy of the presidency. During your first 5 or 6 presidents, probably the assumption in American life was that the Congress, the legislative branch, was the most important branch. That idea is going to start to change with Andrew Jackson, because he's really going to try to use his job as presidency to sort of put him at the center of political life. And he's going to receive a lot of criticism about that, but as we already talked about, he was very popular with the common people, so he was able to withstand that criticism. All right, so there are some of your differences between Jefferson and Jacksonian democracy. All right, so to sum up this lesson, just remember that the age of Jackson is really the time where democracy started to expand from just the white wealthy landowners, like it was when George Washington and John Adams and Thomas Jefferson and the likes were running for president. Under Andrew Jackson, and even really before he came to power, a lot more common people, poor people, are going to start participating in politics. Right, so that should be, kind of the primary theme you should have taken out of this lesson. All right, the next lesson we'll focus on some of Jackson's actual policies once he became president.